When the intern nurse looked me in the face in front of the entire hospital staff and said, "You are old now, your time is over," I wanted to sink into the ground with shame. At that moment, everyone was looking at me with pity. But the next morning, when the hospital administration and security guards entered the ward with files in their hands, we would learn that that new generation genius was not even a nurse, and even her diplomas were fake. And this was just the beginning. Because the truth that came out when her mask fell would end not only her career, but also her freedom. Justice sometimes comes late, but when it hits hard. You will never guess what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like this video. Now let's get to our story. I have spent exactly 10 years in the corridors of this hospital in Pittsburgh. I know every corner, every groan of every patient, every rhythm of the monitors by heart. I am Peyton Miller. I am one of those old school nurses who does her job with love and saves lives with her experience. Or at least that's how I felt until Avery arrived. Avery Collins, our new intern, 23 years old, with smooth skin, a uniform that fits like it was custom made, and a dangerous glint in her eyes. She stormed into the ward like a storm on her very first day. But this wasn't the beautiful energy of fresh blood. This was a destructive hurricane. Although my other colleagues, like Jenna and Liam, were uncomfortable with her attitude and her know-it-all demeanor, no one spoke up. Because Avery walked with incredible confidence, acting as if she owned the hospital. That day, that damn day when everything snapped. I was in front of the medicine cabinet. I was checking procedures, being meticulous as I always am. Avery approached me, waving the tablet in her hand, wearing that condescending smile. "Do you know, Peyton," she said, her voice loud enough to echo through the entire corridor, "is it normal for you to be this slow? I mean, you are old now. I am the new generation. I am faster, more practical. Maybe it is time to step aside and leave your place to us, huh?" The voices in the ward suddenly stopped. Jenna almost dropped the file in her hand. Liam turned his head. I felt my face burning. I was 31 years old, but at that moment I felt 100 years old, useless and washed up. I didn't answer. I just took a deep breath and went back to work. Because I was a professional, but that resentment inside me, it didn't let me sleep that night. When I arrived at the ward the next morning, the air was tense, like the calm before the storm. And that storm broke when the elevator doors opened. Our education coordinator, Dr. Melissa Grant, and HR manager Derek Walsh stepped out. There was an icy expression on their faces that I had never seen before. They headed straight for us to the nurses' station, with thick files in their hands. Avery was typing something on her phone at that moment, probably posting lies on social media about what a wonderful nurse she was. Dr. Grant came to the desk and said in that authoritative voice, "Avery Collins, come here immediately." I saw Avery's confident mask slip for a second. "Is there a problem?" She shrugged, but her voice was trembling. The sound Derek Walsh made when he slammed the file on the desk exploded like a slap. "A problem?" Derek said, staring into Avery's eyes. "According to our records, Avery, you never graduated from any nursing school. Even your internship documents are fake documents edited with Photoshop." Time stopped at that moment. Even I, Peyton, held my breath. That girl who humiliated me by calling me old and boasted about her knowledge. Was she actually nothing? Avery's face drained of all color in an instant, transforming from that fake confident mask into something raw and terrified. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just a pathetic stammering that made everyone in the ward lean in closer to witness her complete unraveling. Dr. Grant crossed her arms and continued in that cold, clinical tone that sent shivers down my spine. "We conducted a routine background check on all new hires this week," she explained, her eyes never leaving Avery's face. "Your nursing school, the prestigious Hamilton Medical Institute you claim to have graduated from with honors, has no record of you ever attending a single class, not one. The registrar's office confirmed they've never even heard your name. Security footage from their campus shows you've never set foot on their property. So tell me, Avery, how exactly did you graduate with distinction from a school you never attended? The silence that followed was deafening and uncomfortable, like watching a car crash in slow motion that you couldn't look away from. Jenna's hand was covering her mouth in shock, and Liam had moved closer to me, probably sensing I needed support after yesterday's humiliation. But honestly, I wasn't feeling triumphant or vindicated in that moment. I was feeling something else entirely, something like disbelief mixed with a strange kind of sadness, because this girl had been treating patients, had been near vulnerable people, and she had no qualification whatsoever to be doing any of it. Derek Walsh opened another section of the file and pulled out what looked like printed screenshots. "We also found these," he said, showing them to everyone assembled. "These are posts from your social media accounts where you documented your supposed nursing school journey. Graduation photos, study sessions, clinical rotations. We sent these images to Hamilton Medical Institute's faculty, and they identified the real students in these photos. You photoshopped your face onto other people's bodies, Avery. You literally stole someone else's entire educational journey and presented it as your own." The audacity, the sheer calculated deception of it all was staggering. Avery finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate, high-pitched whine that bore no resemblance to the confident, condescending tone she'd used on me just yesterday. "I can explain," she said, her hands shaking visibly now. "This is all a misunderstanding. I did study nursing, just not at Hamilton. There were some administrative issues with my transcripts, that's all. I have the knowledge. I have the skills. You've seen me work. I'm good at this." Dr. Grant's expression didn't soften even slightly. "No, Avery, you don't have the knowledge, and you certainly don't have the skills. We reviewed every single patient interaction you've had since you started here 3 weeks ago. Do you know what we found? You've been copying procedures by watching other nurses, mimicking their movements without understanding the why behind any of it. You nearly administered the wrong dosage of insulin to a diabetic patient yesterday because you couldn't properly read the prescription. Nurse Roberts caught your error before it became fatal. You've been one mistake away from killing someone, and you didn't even realize it because you lack the most basic medical training." My heart clenched at that revelation. A patient could have died. Someone's mother, father, child could have been killed because of this girl's desperate need to play pretend in a profession she had no business being in. The weight of what could have happened settled over the room like a heavy fog, and I saw the reality of the situation finally registering on Avery's face as tears started streaming down her cheeks. Though whether they were tears of genuine remorse or just fear of consequences, I couldn't tell. Security officers appeared at the elevator doors, their presence adding another layer of gravity to the situation. Derek continued speaking, his voice now taking on an official, legal tone that made everything feel even more real and terrifying. "Avery Collins, you are hereby terminated from this position, effective immediately. Furthermore, the hospital is pressing charges for fraud, identity theft, and reckless endangerment. You impersonated a licensed medical professional, which is a felony in Pennsylvania. You will need to come with these officers now. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right and contact an attorney." As the security officers moved forward to escort her out, Avery's composure completely shattered. She started sobbing uncontrollably, her whole body shaking with the force of her breakdown. She looked around the room desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone who might help her or show her sympathy. Her eyes landed on me, and for a moment I saw something in them that looked almost like an apology. But then it shifted into something uglier, something defensive and angry. "This is your fault," she suddenly screamed at me, pointing her finger accusingly. "You were jealous of me from the start. You couldn't stand that I was younger and better than you, so you reported me. You ruined my life. Because you're a bitter old woman who can't accept that her time is over." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and I felt my face flush hot with a mixture of anger and hurt. I hadn't reported her. I hadn't even known there was anything to report until 5 minutes ago. But here she was, in her final moments before being escorted out in disgrace, still trying to tear me down and make me the villain in her twisted narrative. Dr. Grant stepped between us before I could respond. Peyton Miller had nothing to do with this investigation, she said firmly. The background checks were routine and mandatory for all new hires. This was discovered through standard hospital protocol, not because of any personal vendetta. Your own actions brought you here, Avery, no one else's. Take responsibility for what you've done. But Avery wasn't listening anymore. She was being led away by the security officers, still crying and protesting, her voice echoing down the hallway as the elevator doors closed behind her. You're all going to regret this. I'm going to sue. This is discrimination. My father is a lawyer. The threats faded as she disappeared from view, leaving behind a ward full of stunned staff members trying to process what had just happened. The silence that followed her departure was heavy and uncomfortable. Jenna was the first to break it, walking over to me and placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Peyton, I'm so sorry, she said softly. The way she treated you yesterday was absolutely unacceptable, and now finding out she wasn't even qualified to be here. I should have said something when she was being so disrespectful to you. We all should have. Liam nodded in agreement, looking genuinely remorseful. She had this way of making everyone feel small and uncertain, he admitted. Like she knew something we didn't, like questioning her would make us look stupid. I hate that we let her get away with treating you like that, Peyton. You're one of the best nurses in this hospital, and she was nothing but a con artist playing dress-up. Their words were kind and meant to be comforting, but I felt oddly empty rather than vindicated. A part of me had wanted some kind of justice for yesterday's humiliation. Sure, but not like this. Not with the knowledge that patients had been at risk, that someone could have died. What if Jenna hadn't caught that insulin error? What if Avery had been assigned to a critical patient during a night shift when supervision was less intense? The what-ifs were overwhelming and terrifying. Dr. Grant approached me with a more gentle expression than she'd worn during Avery's confrontation. Peyton, I want you to know that the administration is aware of the disrespectful treatment you endured from Ms. Collins, she said. We've reviewed the security footage from yesterday's incident in the hallway. Your professionalism in the face of that verbal abuse was exemplary, and it's exactly the kind of character we value in our staff. I also want to personally apologize that our vetting process didn't catch this fraud sooner, before she had the opportunity to create a hostile work environment. I appreciated her words. I really did. But something about the whole situation still felt unresolved and strange. How does someone even attempt something like this? I asked, genuinely bewildered. How does a person with no medical training whatsoever think they can just fake their way into a hospital and treat patients? The risk, the liability, the sheer danger of it all. What was she thinking? Derek Walsh, who had remained behind after the security officers left with Avery, sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. We're still piecing together her motivations, he admitted. From what we've gathered from her social media presence and some preliminary interviews with people who know her, it appears Ms. Collins was obsessed with projecting an image of success and achievement online. She wanted to be seen as a young, brilliant medical professional, someone to admire and envy. The reality is that she dropped out of community college after one semester and had been working retail jobs while living with her parents. She couldn't handle the gap between who she wanted to be and who she actually was, so she created an elaborate fiction. The psychology of it was fascinating in a disturbing way. Avery had built an entire false identity, not just for others, but apparently for herself as well. She'd convinced herself so thoroughly that she belonged in that nurse's uniform that she'd been willing to risk people's lives to maintain the illusion. It was narcissism and desperation wrapped together in a dangerous package, and I'd been her chosen target for derision because my genuine experience and competence had threatened her fragile, constructed reality. As the day progressed and word spread through the hospital about what had happened, I became something of a reluctant celebrity. Nurses from other floors stopped by to express their support and share their own brief encounters with Avery, many of them describing similar feelings of being subtly undermined or dismissed by her during her short time there. It seemed her strategy had been to identify the most respected, experienced staff members and attempt to diminish them, thereby elevating herself by comparison. I'd just been her primary target because we'd worked most closely together. But despite the support and validation from my colleagues, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with Avery's humiliation of me and everything to do with a larger question that was nagging at the back of my mind. How had she gotten through our hiring process in the first place? Hamilton Medical Institute was a real school, and our HR department should have verified her credentials directly with them before she ever set foot in the hospital. The fact that she'd been able to work here for 3 weeks, unsupervised at times, with fake documents meant there was a serious gap in our system that had nothing to do with her individual deception and everything to do with institutional failure. That evening, as my shift was ending and I was gathering my things from my locker, Dr. Grant found me again. She had that look on her face that I'd come to recognize over the years, the one that meant there was more to the story than what had been publicly shared. "Peyton, do you have a moment?" she asked, glancing around to make sure we were alone in the locker room. "There's something else you should know. Something we didn't announce to the entire staff because it's still under investigation." My stomach tightened with apprehension. "What is it?" I asked, sitting down on the bench because suddenly my legs felt unreliable. Dr. Grant sat beside me and lowered her voice. "Avery didn't act alone," she said quietly. "We've discovered that someone in our HR department accepted a bribe to fast-track her application and skip the normal verification procedures. We're still identifying who it was, but there's an internal investigation happening right now. This wasn't just about one disturbed young woman with fake documents. This was a conspiracy that involved at least one employee betraying the trust and safety of this entire institution. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Someone who worked here, someone who was supposed to protect patients and maintain standards, had knowingly allowed an unqualified person to work with vulnerable people for money. The betrayal felt enormous and sickening, like discovering rot in the foundation of a building you'd trusted to be solid. "Who would do that?" I whispered, though I wasn't really expecting an answer. How much money would it take for someone to compromise patient safety like that? Dr. Grant shook her head grimly. "We don't know yet, but we will find out," she promised. "The FBI is involved now because this crosses into federal fraud territory. Whoever helped Avery is going to face serious criminal charges, possibly even more serious than what she's facing, because they had a duty of care and they violated it knowingly for personal gain. I'm telling you this, Peyton, because I want you to be prepared. There's going to be media attention when this story breaks, and your name might come up since you were the nurse she specifically targeted and harassed. The hospital will do everything we can to protect your privacy, but I wanted you to be aware. Media attention." The thought made me want to curl up and disappear. I'd become a nurse because I wanted to help people quietly and competently, not because I wanted to be in the spotlight for being connected to a scandal, but I supposed I didn't have much choice in the matter now. The story was going to unfold whether I wanted it to or not, and all I could do was maintain my integrity and professionalism through whatever came next. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning in my small apartment while my mind raced through everything that had happened and everything that might still be coming. My phone kept buzzing with messages from colleagues, friends who'd heard through the grapevine, even my mother calling from Ohio asking if I was okay, because apparently the story had already made its way to local news websites. I finally turned my phone off completely around midnight and just lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Pittsburgh traffic outside my window and trying to process the surreal nightmare my ordinary work life had become. When morning came, I dragged myself out of bed, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, showered in water as hot as I could stand, and forced myself to eat toast I couldn't taste, while drinking coffee that did nothing to clear the fog in my brain. The thought of going back to that hospital, of walking those familiar corridors that now felt tainted with deception and danger, made my stomach clench. With anxiety, I wasn't accustomed to feeling about my workplace, but I went anyway, because that's what professionals do, because patients needed care regardless of administrative scandals, because hiding at home would solve nothing and only make me feel worse about myself. I arrived at the ward 15 minutes early, as always, changed into my scrubs, tied my hair back with practiced efficiency, and stepped out of the locker room ready to face whatever this day would bring. What I wasn't prepared for was the scene that greeted me at the nurses' station, where a crowd of staff members had gathered around the television mounted on the wall, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and morbid fascination. Jenna spotted me first and immediately rushed over, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the group. "Peyton, you need to see this right now," she said urgently. "It's all over the news, and it's so much worse than we thought." The television was tuned to the local morning news, and there on the screen was a professional photo of Avery looking polished and confident, the kind of headshot you'd use for LinkedIn or a company website. The news anchor was speaking in that serious tone they reserve for particularly scandalous stories, and the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made my blood run cold. Fake nurse worked in 3 hospitals across Pennsylvania, allegedly harmed multiple patients. FBI investigating healthcare fraud ring. 3 hospitals. She'd done this before. This wasn't her first attempt at playing nurse. It was just the first time she'd been caught, or at least the first time it had been made public. How many patients had she touched with her unqualified hands? How many medications had she administered without understanding their interactions or proper dosages? How many lives had she put at risk in her desperate quest to maintain her fake identity? The news report continued with even more disturbing details that made several nurses gasp audibly. According to investigators, the anchor explained, Collins allegedly worked at Bradford Regional Medical Center for 2 months last year before abruptly quitting when supervisors began questioning some of her clinical decisions. She then appeared at Allegheny General Hospital for 6 weeks earlier this year, under a slightly different name, leaving after what staff described as several near-miss incidents with patient care. Her current position at Mercy Hospital Pittsburgh marked her 3rd known placement, though authorities believe there may be additional hospitals where she worked under various aliases. The FBI is urging any healthcare facilities that may have employed someone matching her description to come forward immediately. 3 hospitals, 3 separate institutions where security protocols had failed, where HR departments had been either incompetent or compromised, where patients had been endangered. The scope of it was staggering and terrifying, suggesting not just individual deception but systematic vulnerabilities in how medical professionals were vetted and verified. Liam was shaking his head in disbelief beside me, his face pale with the implications. "How is this even possible in the modern age?" he asked no one in particular. "We have databases, credential verification services, background check companies. How does someone pull this off multiple times without being caught until now?" The news segment shifted to an interview with a spokesperson from the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing, a stern-looking woman with glasses who spoke with barely contained fury about the situation. "This is an absolute violation of public trust and patient safety," she stated firmly. "We are working with law enforcement to identify every facility where Ms. Collins may have worked and to assess any potential harm to patients during those periods. We're also conducting a comprehensive review of how our credential verification systems failed to detect these fraudulent documents. Healthcare facilities must be more diligent in their hiring practices, and we will be implementing mandatory enhanced background checks for all nursing positions statewide as a result of this case." Dr. Grant appeared in the doorway of the ward at that moment, her expression grim and exhausted like she hadn't slept any better than I had. She gestured for everyone to gather around, and the crowd of nurses and medical staff formed a tight circle around her, everyone eager to hear what official information the hospital administration might have about this expanding disaster. "I know you've all seen the news by now," she began without preamble, her voice steady but tired. "I want to address this directly and honestly with you all because you deserve to know what's happening and how it affects our facility. Yes, Avery Collins worked at multiple hospitals before coming here. Yes, the FBI is investigating, and yes, we are cooperating fully with their investigation. What I can tell you is that we've identified the HR staff member who facilitated her fraudulent hiring here at Mercy Hospital." A collective intake of breath rippled through the group. "Who was it?" someone asked from the back, voicing what everyone was thinking. Dr. Grant's jaw tightened. "Marcus Pemberton from Human Resources," she said, and several people gasped because Marcus had worked at Mercy for almost 8 years and was generally well-liked and considered trustworthy. He was arrested early this morning at his home. Investigators found evidence that he accepted $15,000 from Ms. Collins in exchange for bypassing our standard verification procedures and creating false employment records. He's also suspected of providing similar services to her at the other 2 hospitals where she worked, though those investigations are still ongoing. He's facing multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, accepting bribes, and reckless endangerment. $15,000. That was the price Marcus Pemberton had put on patient safety, on professional integrity, on the trust that sick and vulnerable people placed in hospitals when they came through our doors seeking help and healing. The betrayal of it burned in my chest like acid, making me feel sick and angry in equal measure. Jenna was crying quietly beside me, and I realized she'd actually been friends with Marcus, had gone out for drinks with him and his wife on several occasions. The personal dimension of the betrayal must have felt even more acute for her, knowing that someone she'd trusted and liked had been willing to compromise everything for money. Dr. Grant continued speaking, her voice taking on a more gentle but firm tone. "I know this is shocking and upsetting for all of you, and the hospital is providing access to counseling services if anyone needs support processing this situation. What I need from all of you now is to focus on your patients and your work. We cannot let this scandal compromise the excellent care we provide every single day. Our patients are scared and confused because they've seen the news too, and they need us to be stable, competent, and reassuring. Can I count on you all to maintain that standard?" A chorus of affirmative responses came from the assembled staff, myself included, because despite everything, despite the shock and betrayal and anger, we were still healthcare professionals with a job to do and people depending on us. Dr. Grant dismissed the group, and everyone slowly dispersed to their various stations and assignments, the usual morning energy replaced with a subdued, almost shell-shocked atmosphere that would take time to dissipate. I was checking my assignment for the day when Derek Walsh from HR approached me, looking somehow even more exhausted than Dr. Grant had, which made sense considering his entire department was now under intense scrutiny and investigation. "Peyton, I need to speak with you privately," he said quietly. "Can you spare 10 minutes before your shift officially starts?" My stomach dropped with fresh anxiety because private conversations with HR were rarely good news, but I nodded and followed him to a small conference room down the hallway. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit, then took the seat across from me with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of this entire disaster. "First, I want to apologize to you personally," he began, meeting my eyes directly. "Marcus Pemberton worked under my supervision, and his actions reflect a failure in my management and oversight. You were targeted by Avery Collins, harassed and humiliated, and it happened because my department failed to catch a fraud that should have been obvious if proper procedures had been followed. I take full responsibility for that failure, and I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced." His apology seemed genuine, and I appreciated it, but it didn't change what had happened or erase the sting of Avery's words in that corridor. "It's not your fault that Marcus was corrupt," I said carefully. "You can't monitor every decision every employee makes. The system failed, yes, but that doesn't make you personally responsible for his choices." Derek shook his head slightly. The system failed because I didn't ensure adequate oversight and verification redundancies were in place, he countered. That's literally my job, and I didn't do it well enough. But that's not actually why I asked you here. There's something else, something the FBI discovered during their investigation that directly involves you, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you hear it anywhere else. My heart started pounding in my chest, a sick feeling of dread washing over me. What do you mean, it involves me? I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Derek pulled out a folder from the briefcase he'd brought with him and opened it carefully, revealing what looked like printed screenshots and documents. During their investigation of Avery's social media accounts and private communications, the FBI found extensive documentation of what they're calling a targeted harassment campaign against you specifically, he explained, showing me the first page. These are messages between Avery and several of her online friends, where she explicitly states that her goal was to destroy your reputation and get you fired so she could take your position and the recognition that came with it. She researched you before she even applied here, Peyton. She knew you were well-respected, experienced, and valued by both staff and patients. She specifically chose this hospital because you worked here, and her entire plan was to systematically undermine you until you either quit or got dismissed for appearing incompetent compared to her supposed brilliance. I stared at the documents in front of me, at screenshots of messages where Avery described me as an obstacle to be removed, where she strategized about how to make me look slow and outdated, where she celebrated small victories like getting other staff members to question my methods or getting patients to request her instead of me for simple tasks. The level of calculated malice was breathtaking and terrifying, revealing that what I'd experienced wasn't just casual disrespect or youthful arrogance, but a deliberate, planned campaign of professional destruction. She'd spent hours analyzing my work patterns, identifying moments where she could insert herself and make me look inadequate by comparison, crafting a narrative where I was the aging, incompetent nurse being outshined by the brilliant young newcomer. Why me specifically? I finally managed to ask, though my voice was shaking. There are dozens of experienced nurses in this hospital. Why target me? Derek looked at me with something like sympathy mixed with admiration. According to her messages, it's because you're genuinely good at what you do, and patients love you. She needed someone with a solid reputation to tear down because destroying someone who was already struggling wouldn't have given her the credibility boost she was looking for. She wanted people to say, wow, that new nurse is so amazing. She's even better than Peyton Miller, and Peyton has been here for a decade. Your competence and reputation were exactly what made you valuable as a target. It's twisted logic, but that's how her mind worked. The realization that I'd been deliberately chosen, carefully studied, and methodically attacked felt like a violation beyond the simple workplace harassment I'd initially perceived it as. This wasn't random cruelty or personality conflict. This was predatory behavior, calculated and cold, and I'd been the prey without even realizing I was being hunted. My hands were trembling as I looked through more of the screenshots, seeing messages where Avery described feeling powerful when she saw my face flush with embarrassment, where she laughed about how easy it was to make me doubt myself, where she planned her next moves in what she called Operation Takedown. There's more, Derek said gently, and I wasn't sure I could handle more, but I nodded for him to continue. The FBI also found evidence that Avery was planning to escalate her campaign against you. She'd created fake patient complaints using temporary email addresses and burner phones. Complaints alleging that you were rough with patients, that you made medication errors, that you were distracted and unprofessional. She was going to submit them anonymously to our patient feedback system in increasing numbers until administration had no choice but to investigate you formally. If her fraud hadn't been discovered when it was, you would have been facing a formal review board within the next 2 weeks based on fabricated evidence designed to destroy your career. The room felt like it was spinning, and I had to focus on my breathing to keep from hyperventilating. She was going to frame me, I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. She was going to manufacture evidence to get me fired, or maybe even lose my license, all so she could take my place while pretending to be something she wasn't. The sheer scope of the malice, the detailed planning, the willingness to destroy someone's entire career and livelihood for personal gain was sociopathic in its calculation. Derek nodded gravely. That's exactly what she was planning, which is why the FBI and the district attorney's office are taking this case extremely seriously. This isn't just about fraudulent credentials anymore. This is about stalking, harassment, conspiracy, and attempted career destruction. The charges against her are mounting, and with this evidence, she's looking at significant prison time. They also want to interview you as a victim in this case, and they'll be contacting you through official channels soon to set that up. I wanted to prepare you for that conversation and let you know that the hospital will provide legal support if you need it. I sat there in that small conference room trying to process everything I'd just learned, trying to reconcile the embarrassing but relatively minor workplace conflict I thought I was dealing with into this massive criminal conspiracy that had put patients at risk across multiple hospitals while specifically targeting me for destruction. It was too much, too big, too overwhelming to fully grasp in a single moment. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream, and part of me wanted to just go back to bed and pretend none of this was happening. But I didn't do any of those things, because that's not who Peyton Miller is, even when everything feels like it's falling apart around her. Instead, I thanked Derek for his honesty and transparency, gathered the copies of documents he offered me for my records, and walked back out into the ward to start my shift like the professional I'd spent a decade becoming. My patients needed me, and I wasn't going to let Avery Collins or Marcus Pemberton or anyone else's corruption stop me from doing the job I loved. The morning was difficult, not because of the work itself, but because patients kept asking questions about the news reports they'd seen, wanting reassurance that they were safe, that the nurses caring for them were legitimate and qualified. I spent extra time with each patient explaining the situation calmly and honestly, showing them my credentials when they asked, being patient with their fears, because those fears were completely reasonable given what had happened. Mrs. Patterson in room 304, a sweet elderly woman recovering from hip replacement surgery, grabbed my hand when I came to check her vitals and said with tears in her eyes, "I was so scared when I saw the news, Peyton. I thought maybe you weren't real either. Maybe nobody here was real." Her fear was heartbreaking because it represented a fundamental breach of trust that extended far beyond just Avery's individual deception. Every patient in this hospital had come here believing they would be cared for by qualified professionals, and now that assumption had been shattered, leaving them vulnerable and uncertain about who they could trust with their health and their lives. I squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand gently and looked directly into her worried eyes. "I'm very real," I promised her. I graduated from the University of Pittsburgh School of Nursing in 2018, did my clinical rotations at UPMC Presbyterian, and have been a licensed registered nurse in Pennsylvania for 10 years. You can verify my credentials through the state board's public database if you want to. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm going to take excellent care of you just like I have been since you arrived. You're safe with me." Her expression relaxed slightly, though the worry lines around her eyes didn't completely disappear. "I trust you, Peyton," she said softly. "You've been so kind to me, so patient. I just needed to hear you say it, needed to know for sure. This whole thing is so scary. Knowing that girl was here touching patients, giving medications, making decisions about people's health when she didn't know what she was doing. What if she'd been assigned to me instead of you? What if she'd given me the wrong medicine or done something during my surgery preparation that could have hurt me? Those were the questions haunting everyone, the terrible what-ifs that would probably never have complete answers. I didn't have perfect words to soothe those fears, so I just stayed with Mrs. Patterson for a few extra minutes, adjusting her pillows, bringing her fresh water, talking about her grandchildren and the garden she was looking forward to tending when she recovered, grounding both of us in the normal human connection that was the real heart of nursing beneath all the technical skills and medical knowledge. By the time I left her room, she was smiling again. And that small victory felt enormous, given everything else that was happening. Lunchtime came, and I found myself in the break room with Jenna and Liam, the three of us sitting in exhausted silence while picking at food we barely tasted. The television in the corner was still running news coverage of the scandal, though we'd muted it because none of us could handle hearing the same shocking details repeated over and over. Jenna finally broke the silence with a question that had probably been bothering her all morning. "Do you think there are others like her out there right now?" she asked quietly. "Other fake nurses working in hospitals we don't know about yet, putting patients at risk while nobody suspects a thing?" The thought was chilling and unfortunately very possible, given how Avery had managed to work at 3 different facilities before being caught. Liam rubbed his face tiredly and said what we were all thinking. The system clearly has holes in it, massive ones, if she could pull this off 3 times. Yeah, there could definitely be others. Maybe not many, hopefully not many, but the possibility exists until every hospital in the country tightens their verification procedures and starts doing retrospective checks on current staff. I thought about all the hospitals I'd worked at or visited throughout my career, all the nurses I'd met and worked alongside, and tried to imagine discovering that any of them had been frauds the whole time. It seemed impossible. And yet here we were living through exactly that scenario. So clearly it wasn't impossible at all, but terrifyingly real and achievable for someone determined and shameless enough to try. The conversation eventually shifted to Marcus Pemberton and the incomprehensible decision he'd made to sell out his integrity for money. Jenna was still clearly struggling with the betrayal, her voice thick with hurt when she talked about the barbecues at his house, the times he'd given her career advice, the way his kids called her Aunt Jenna. "I thought I knew him," she said, wiping at her eyes with a napkin. "I thought he was a good person, honest and decent. How do you reconcile that with what he did? How do you accept that someone you trusted was capable of putting patients' lives at risk for $15,000? There wasn't a good answer to that question, just the uncomfortable reality that people are complex and capable of compartmentalizing their actions in ways that let them do terrible things while still maintaining relationships and seeming normal in other areas of their lives. Marcus probably told himself it wasn't really that harmful, that the nurses he helped get hired were probably qualified enough even if their paperwork wasn't perfect, that he needed the money for something important enough to justify the risk. Human rationalization is powerful and dangerous, letting people cross lines they never thought they would while convincing themselves they're still fundamentally good. The afternoon brought another unexpected development when Dr. Melissa Grant found me in the corridor and asked me to come to her office immediately. Her expression was neutral, but there was an energy about her that felt significant, like something important had happened or was about to happen. I followed her through the administrative wing to her corner office, where she closed the door behind us and gestured to a comfortable chair before sitting across from me rather than behind her desk, a posture that suggested this wasn't a formal disciplinary conversation, but something more personal. "Peyton, I want to tell you something that isn't public knowledge yet, but will be announced tomorrow morning," she began, leaning forward slightly. The hospital board met in emergency session this morning to discuss the scandal and its fallout. Obviously, there are going to be major changes in our hiring and verification procedures, but that's not what I wanted to talk to you about. The board also discussed you specifically, your handling of the situation with Avery, your professionalism, and the way you've responded to discovering you were deliberately targeted. They were extremely impressed, and they asked me to extend an offer to you. "An offer?" I repeated, confused about what kind of offer could be relevant at a time like this. Dr. Grant smiled slightly, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in days. "The board wants to create a new position, a patient safety and professional standards liaison, someone who would work between administration and floor staff to ensure that gaps like the ones Avery exploited never happen again. This person would be involved in hiring processes, would conduct spot checks on credentials and procedures, would serve as an advocate for both staff and patients when concerns arise, and would help develop protocols to prevent exactly this kind of situation from recurring. It would be a leadership position, Peyton, with a significant increase in responsibility and compensation, and they want you to be the first person to hold this role. I sat there stunned, my brain struggling to process what I was hearing. They want me to leave floor nursing? I asked, because despite everything, despite the exhaustion and stress and emotional toll of the past few days, I couldn't imagine not being directly involved in patient care anymore. Not entirely, Dr. Grant clarified. The position would be hybrid, about 60% administrative work and 40% clinical hours on the floor. You'd maintain your nursing skills and patient relationships while also having the authority and oversight to make systemic changes. You'd report directly to me and the chief medical officer, and you'd have a seat at the table when major decisions affecting patient safety are being made. The board believes that someone who has lived through what you've experienced, who understands both the clinical realities and the institutional vulnerabilities, is exactly who we need in this role. The offer was incredibly flattering and represented a huge professional opportunity, the kind of advancement that most nurses would be thrilled to receive. But it also felt overwhelming and complicated, layered with questions about whether I was ready for that kind of responsibility, whether I could handle the political and administrative aspects of such a position, whether I even wanted to move in that direction with my career. I've always been a bedside nurse, I said slowly, trying to articulate my concerns. That's my identity, my passion. I love the direct patient contact, the immediate impact, the hands-on care. I'm not sure I'm cut out for administrative work and policy development. Dr. Grant nodded understandingly. I had similar concerns when I made the transition from clinical practice to administration, she admitted. But here's what I learned. You don't stop being a nurse when you take on leadership responsibilities, you just expand how you practice nursing. Instead of caring for 5 or 6 patients during a shift, you're creating systems that protect hundreds or thousands of patients. Instead of catching one medication error, you're preventing entire categories of errors from happening in the first place. The impact is different but no less meaningful, and arguably even more important. Her words made sense intellectually, but emotionally I was still tangled up in doubt and uncertainty. Can I think about it? I asked. This is a huge decision, and I don't want to make it impulsively while I'm still processing everything that's happened. Of course, Dr. Grant said immediately. Take a week, think it over, talk to people you trust. The position isn't going anywhere, and we'd rather you take the time to make a thoughtful decision than rush into something you're not comfortable with. But Peyton, I want you to know that I personally believe you'd be exceptional in this role, and I think it could be exactly what this hospital needs to heal from this scandal and move forward stronger than before. I left her office with my head spinning, walking through the corridors in a daze while trying to imagine myself in this new role she'd described. Could I really make that transition? Did I want to? The timing felt strange, like accepting the position would be admitting that Avery had somehow won by forcing me out of pure clinical practice, even though logically I knew that wasn't true, and that leadership positions were advancements rather than retreats. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the nurse's station, and I pulled it out to see a text from an unknown number. This is FBI Special Agent Diana Torres. I'm leading the investigation into Avery Collins and the healthcare fraud case. I need to schedule an interview with you as soon as possible. Please call me at this number. The reality of my involvement in a federal criminal investigation hit me fresh and hard. I was going to have to sit down with FBI agents and recount every interaction with Avery, every subtle undermining comment, every moment of self-doubt she'd deliberately planted in my mind. I was going to have to be a witness in a trial, probably have my testimony picked apart by defense attorneys trying to defend the indefensible. The prospect was exhausting and intimidating, but also necessary, because Avery needed to face full consequences for what she'd done. not just to me, but to every patient she'd endangered and every staff member she'd manipulated. The week that followed was a surreal blur of FBI interviews, media requests that I declined, supportive messages from colleagues and former professors, and long, sleepless nights where I replayed everything in my mind trying to make sense of how my ordinary life had become this extraordinary nightmare. Agent Torres turned out to be a sharp, compassionate woman in her early 40s who spent 3 hours with me going through every detail of my interactions with Avery, her tone never judgmental but always probing for specifics that could strengthen the prosecution's case. She showed me evidence they'd gathered that I hadn't seen before, including a journal Avery had kept, where she documented her campaign against me in disturbing detail, complete with sketches of the ward layout and notes about the best times to undermine me when maximum witnesses would be present. Reading those pages felt like looking into the mind of someone deeply disturbed and dangerously obsessed, and it made me realize how lucky I was that her fraud had been discovered when it was, before she could escalate to whatever her ultimate plan had been. The breakthrough came on day 6 after the initial revelation, when Agent Torres called me personally with news that changed everything. "Peyton, we found something significant," she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "During our investigation of Marcus Pemberton's finances and communications, we uncovered evidence of a much larger operation. He wasn't just helping Avery, he was part of a network that's been selling fraudulent credentials and placement services to unqualified individuals across multiple states and in several different professions, not just nursing, but also pharmacy technicians, medical assistants, even one case of a fake physician assistant. We're talking about potentially dozens of people working in healthcare facilities right now with completely fabricated backgrounds. The scope of what she was describing was staggering and terrifying, representing a systemic threat to patient safety on a scale that went far beyond one disturbed young woman's individual deception. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're still piecing together the timeline, but it appears this network has been operating for at least 4 years, possibly longer," Agent Torres explained. "Marcus wasn't even the mastermind. He was more of a regional facilitator. The person running the whole operation is someone we've been trying to identify and locate, and that's actually why I'm calling you. We need your help with something that might be dangerous, and I need to be completely upfront with you about the risks involved." My heart started pounding, because the word dangerous in connection with an FBI investigation was never casual or exaggerated. "What kind of help?" I asked carefully. Agent Torres took a breath before explaining. "We've been monitoring Avery's communications from jail, and she's been trying to reach out to the person running this credential fraud network, trying to negotiate some kind of deal where she provides information in exchange for them helping her with legal fees and potentially arranging for her to disappear if she makes bail. We want to use that communication channel to set up a meeting, but we need someone the network leader would believe is legitimate. Someone who could pose as a new client looking to purchase fraudulent credentials. Someone like you, Peyton. Someone with genuine nursing experience who could speak knowledgeably enough to seem credible while wearing a wire and helping us gather evidence for arrest. She wanted me to go, undercover, essentially, to meet with dangerous criminals who had already demonstrated their willingness to put countless lives at risk for profit. The request was shocking and frightening, but before I could immediately refuse out of self-preservation instinct, Agent Torres continued speaking. "I know this is asking a lot, probably too much, and I want you to know that you have every right to say no, and that decision will be completely respected with no negative consequences. But Peyton, if we can bring down this entire network, we'll be preventing future Averys from ever getting into hospitals in the first place. We'll be protecting patients across the entire region, maybe the entire country. You have an opportunity to turn what happened to you into something that saves lives and stops these people from destroying both careers and potentially killing people through incompetent care." Her words struck something deep inside me, connecting to the fundamental reason I'd become a nurse in the first place, which was to protect and help people. This was a chance to do that on a scale I'd never imagined, to transform my victimization into something meaningful and protective. It was also terrifying and risky and completely outside my comfort zone. But wasn't that exactly when courage mattered most? When it would be easier and safer to step back, but you chose to step forward anyway. "I'll do it," I heard myself saying before my rational brain could talk me out of it. "Tell me what you need me to do." The next 72 hours were intensive preparation, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Agent Torres and her team trained me on how to wear a concealed recording device, how to steer conversations toward admissions of guilt without being obvious, how to stay calm if things went wrong, how to signal for backup if I felt threatened. They created a cover story for me, crafting a believable narrative about a nurse who'd made mistakes and lost her license, who was desperate to get back into healthcare and willing to pay for fraudulent credentials to make that happen. They even created fake social media profiles and planted false information in online databases to support my cover identity, building a digital trail that would withstand scrutiny if the network leader decided to check my background. The meeting was set for a coffee shop in downtown Pittsburgh, a public location where FBI agents could maintain visual surveillance without being obvious. I arrived 15 minutes early as instructed, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone around me could hear it. The wire taped to my skin felt enormous and obvious, even though Agent Torres had assured me it was virtually undetectable. I ordered a coffee I couldn't imagine drinking and sat at a corner table with sight lines to both entrances, exactly as I'd been coached to do. When the woman walked in at precisely the appointed time, I recognized her instantly even though we'd never met, because I'd been shown surveillance photos during my preparation. She was in her mid-50s, professionally dressed, with the kind of polished appearance that could belong to any middle management businesswoman, completely unremarkable and forgettable, which was probably exactly why she'd been successful at running a criminal enterprise for years without detection. She sat across from me with a pleasant smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "You must be Sarah," she said, using my cover name. "I'm Christine. It's good to meet you. I understand you're interested in rejoining the healthcare profession despite some unfortunate circumstances in your past." The conversation that followed was the most stressful 30 minutes of my life, carefully navigating between seeming desperate enough to be believable while still asking the right questions to gather useful evidence. Christine was cautious, but also clearly experienced at recruiting clients, walking me through the services her network offered with the casual professionalism of someone selling legitimate business solutions rather than life-threatening fraud. She explained pricing structures, timeline expectations, the various packages available depending on whether I needed just basic credentials or more comprehensive background fabrication. She mentioned other clients who'd successfully used their services, dropping just enough detail to potentially identify them without giving full names. And critically, she admitted to the scope of their operation, mentioning placements in 6 different states and bragging about never having a client discovered until Avery's situation, which she described as an unfortunate anomaly caused by the client's inability to maintain proper discretion. When I mentioned concerns about getting caught like Avery had, Christine leaned forward with an almost maternal expression and said something that made my blood run cold while simultaneously giving the FBI exactly what they needed. "Sweetie, Avery's problem wasn't our system. It was her personality. She couldn't just do the job. She had to draw attention to herself, had to make enemies, had to create drama. If you can walk into a hospital, keep your head down, do competent work without trying to be a star, you can have a 20-year career on fraudulent credentials and nobody will ever look twice at you." That's what most of our clients do, and that's why they're still working happily in healthcare right now while Avery is sitting in jail. The system only catches you if you give them a reason to look closely. Those words, delivered so casually over coffee in a crowded shop, revealed the horrifying truth that there were indeed multiple fake healthcare workers still operating in hospitals at that very moment. People who'd bought their credentials from this network and were successfully fooling everyone around them. as Christine continued talking, detailing how her network had survived for years by being selective about clients and maintaining extensive security protocols. FBI agents were receiving every word through my wire and preparing to move in for arrest. When she finally reached across the table to shake my hand and welcome me as a new client, pending payment processing, 3 agents appeared seemingly out of nowhere, identifying themselves and ordering Christine to keep her hands visible. Her expression transformed from pleasant professionalism to shocked fury in an instant, her eyes snapping to me with recognition and rage. "You're a cop," she hissed as agents secured her wrists with handcuffs. Agent Torres appeared at my side, placing a protective hand on my shoulder while reading Christine her rights in that official monotone that made everything feel surreal and movie-like. But even more satisfying than Christine's arrest was what followed in the subsequent weeks as the FBI used the evidence from that recorded conversation, along with data seized from her devices, to identify and arrest 12 other people involved in the credential fraud network, including several other HR professionals at hospitals across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. They also identified 17 individuals currently working in healthcare facilities with fraudulent credentials, including 2 at my own hospital, Mercy Hospital, Pittsburgh, which led to another wave of shock and security reviews across the entire facility. The network Christine had built was methodically dismantled piece by piece, and while I couldn't undo the harm that had already been done to patients who'd been treated by unqualified personnel, I could at least feel that I'd helped prevent future harm to countless others. The day of Avery's sentencing arrived 6 months after the initial revelation, and I attended the hearing because Agent Torres thought it might provide closure, and because, honestly, I needed to see this through to the end. Avery looked small and defeated in her orange jumpsuit, nothing like the confident, cruel young woman who'd stood in that hospital corridor and told me I was old and useless and past my time. The judge was thorough and harsh, detailing each charge and the evidence supporting it before pronouncing a sentence of 8 years in federal prison for healthcare fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. 8 years where she wouldn't be able to hurt patients or destroy careers. 8 years to hopefully reflect on the magnitude of what she'd done and the lives she'd put at risk. When given the opportunity to address the court, Avery stood and delivered what I suspected was a prepared statement written by her attorney, expressing remorse and claiming she'd made terrible mistakes driven by mental health struggles and family pressure. But when she turned to look at me directly, something genuine flashed in her eyes, something that might have actually been real regret, mixed with resentment. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, Nurse Miller," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You didn't deserve to be targeted like that. I was sick and desperate, and I made choices that were unforgivable. I hope someday you can forgive me even though I don't deserve it." I didn't respond, just maintained eye contact until she looked away and sat back down. Forgiveness wasn't something I was ready to offer yet, and maybe I never would be. But I also didn't feel the burning anger toward her that I'd expected. Instead, I felt something more like pity for a person who destroyed her own life chasing an image and an identity that had never been real, who traded actual achievement for hollow performance and lost everything in the process. As I left the courthouse that day, I ran into Mrs. Patterson from room 304, the elderly hip replacement patient who'd been so scared when the scandal first broke. She was walking with only a cane now, her recovery progressing beautifully, and her face lit up when she saw me. "Peyton," she exclaimed, moving toward me carefully. "I was hoping I'd see you. I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for me, and to tell you I'm so proud of what you did with the FBI. You're a hero, you know that?" I hugged her gently, mindful of her still healing hip, and shook my head. "I'm not a hero, Mrs. Patterson. I'm just a nurse who wanted to protect patients. That's the job." But she was having none of my deflection. "You're a hero to me and to everyone who'll never know how you kept them safe from people like that girl. Don't diminish what you did. Accept it, be proud of it, let it change you in good ways. Her words stayed with me as I drove back to the hospital for my first official day in my new position as patient safety and professional standards liaison, the role I'd eventually accepted after a week of careful consideration and long conversations with people I trusted. The transition hadn't been easy, adjusting to more administrative responsibilities while maintaining my clinical hours, learning to navigate hospital politics and institutional resistance to change. But I'd already made significant impacts, implementing new verification protocols that included multiple redundant checks on credentials, creating anonymous reporting systems for staff to raise concerns about colleagues without fear of retaliation, and developing training programs to help nurses and other healthcare workers identify signs of fraudulent or incompetent practitioners among their peers. 6 months into the new role, I received an email that brought tears to my eyes. It was from a nurse at a hospital in Ohio who'd attended one of my training sessions and had subsequently identified a medical assistant on her unit whose credentials didn't hold up under the scrutiny I'd taught her to apply. Investigation revealed another fraud case, another person who'd purchased fake credentials and slipped through insufficient verification processes. Because of what I'd taught that nurse, because of the protocols we developed after Avery's exposure, a potentially dangerous situation had been caught before any patients were harmed. That medical assistant was now facing charges, and patients were protected. That was when I finally understood what Dr. Grant had meant about the different but equally meaningful impact of leadership roles. My story became something of a cautionary tale in healthcare circles, featured in nursing journals and safety conferences as an example of both how systems can fail and how they can be strengthened. I was invited to speak at my alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh School of Nursing, to graduating students about professionalism, ethics, and vigilance. Standing at that podium, looking out at young faces eager to begin their careers, I thought about my younger self and how naive I'd been about the darkness that could exist within our profession. You will meet people who don't belong in healthcare, I told those students. People who view nursing as a job rather than a calling, people who cut corners, people who lack integrity. And in rare, terrifying cases, you'll encounter people who are there for completely fraudulent reasons. Your responsibility isn't just to your patients, but to the profession itself. When you see something wrong, you speak up. When you sense something isn't right, you investigate. When you witness incompetence or deception, you report it. Because silence in healthcare isn't just complicity, it's potentially deadly. 2 years after the scandal, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I was making clinical rounds when I encountered a young nurse I didn't recognize working in the ICU. She introduced herself as Riley Chen, recently transferred from another facility, and something about her interaction with a ventilator patient made me pause and watch more carefully. She wasn't doing anything obviously wrong, but there was a hesitation in her movements, a quality of uncertainty that seemed unusual for someone supposedly experienced enough to be working in intensive care. I engaged her in conversation, asking casual questions about her background and training, and while her answers were smooth enough, something about them felt rehearsed and hollow. Maybe I was being paranoid, seeing ghosts where none existed, traumatized by my experience with Avery into suspecting everyone. Or maybe I was finally properly calibrated to detect the subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. I followed protocol, the very protocol I'd helped create, and flagged her credentials for secondary verification. Within 24 hours, we discovered that Riley Chen's nursing license was real, but had been suspended 2 years earlier for substance abuse issues she'd never disclosed. She'd continued working by carefully choosing facilities that did only cursory background checks, always moving on before anyone noticed inconsistencies. She wasn't as comprehensively fraudulent as Avery had been, but she was still deceiving employers and putting patients at risk. Her removal from the hospital happened quietly and professionally, and while it wasn't the dramatic exposure that Avery's case had been, it was perhaps more significant because it represented the system working as it should, catching problems before they escalated into disasters. That night, driving home through Pittsburgh's familiar streets, I thought about the journey I'd been on since that terrible day when Avery had stood in the corridor and tried to destroy me with her words. She'd called me old, past my time, obsolete and ready to be discarded. She'd tried to make me believe I was less than I was, tried to diminish my worth and steal my position. But in the end, her cruelty had transformed me into something stronger and more effective than I'd ever been before. I was still a nurse, still passionate about patient care, but now I was also a guardian of the profession itself, someone who protected not just individual patients during shifts, but entire systems and populations through leadership and advocacy. Avery had spent 8 years in prison. Marcus Pemberton got 15 years for his more extensive involvement in the credential fraud network, and Christine, the mastermind, received 25 years for running an operation that had endangered countless lives across multiple states. Justice had been served comprehensively and thoroughly, not just to punish wrongdoing, but to send a clear message that healthcare fraud would be met with maximum consequences. The hospital industry had been shaken by the revelations, leading to nationwide reforms in credentialing processes and much more rigorous oversight of hiring practices. Patients were safer because of what had happened, because one woman's cruel ambition had accidentally exposed vulnerabilities that desperately needed addressing. And me? I was okay. More than okay, actually. I'd found purpose and meaning in the aftermath of trauma, had transformed victimization into advocacy, had turned my worst professional experience into an opportunity to make lasting, positive change. Every time I stopped a fraudulent healthcare worker from harming patients, every time I improved a protocol that closed a vulnerability, every time I trained someone to be more vigilant and thoughtful about protecting their profession, I was winning. Not in some petty revenge kind of way, but in the most meaningful way possible, by making sure that what happened to me and what Avery tried to do could never happen again, at least not easily, at least not without significant barriers. The final twist came 3 years after everything began, when I received a letter forwarded through the FBI from Avery herself, now serving her sentence at a federal correctional institution. Agent Torres called to let me know it was coming and to assure me I had no obligation to read it if I didn't want to. But curiosity won out, and I opened that envelope on a quiet evening at home. The letter was handwritten, several pages long, and surprisingly honest. Avery wrote about her time in prison, the therapy she was receiving, the slow, painful process of understanding why she'd made the choices she'd made and hurt the people she'd hurt. She wrote about growing up feeling inadequate and invisible, about parents who demanded perfection but never provided support, about an older sister who was a successful doctor and cast a shadow Avery felt she could never escape. She wrote about how social media had amplified her desperate need to appear successful and accomplished, how the likes and comments and admiration from strangers had become addictive and essential to her sense of self-worth. None of it excused what she'd done, and she acknowledged that clearly. But it did humanize her in ways I hadn't expected. She wrote about understanding now how dangerous her actions had been, how her need for external validation had blinded her to the real human cost of her deception. She apologized again, more sincerely than in the courtroom, without the performance aspect or the attorney's guidance. And then, in the final paragraph, she wrote something that surprised me. Because of you, Nurse Miller, because of how you responded to what I did, because of the changes you've implemented and the people you've trained, I've actually found a strange kind of peace. I know I did terrible things, but at least those terrible things led to something good. At least my biggest failure became the catalyst for meaningful change. That doesn't earn me forgiveness, but it gives me something to hold on to in here, knowing that my destruction wasn't entirely meaningless. Thank you for taking the worst thing I've ever done and turning it into something that protects people. You're the nurse I pretended to be, the professional I could never actually become. I hope you have a good life, the life you deserve, and that I tried to steal from you. I read that letter 3 times, sitting on my couch with tears streaming down my face, not entirely sure what I was feeling, but knowing it was complicated and real and important. Eventually, I wrote a short response, not forgiving but not condemning either, just acknowledging her words and wishing her genuine growth and healing during her remaining years of incarceration. I didn't owe her that kindness, but I gave it anyway, because holding on to anger and resentment was exhausting and ultimately self-destructive. 5 years after that terrible day in the corridor, I stood in front of the American Nurses Association at their national conference, delivering a keynote address about professional integrity and system vulnerabilities in healthcare credentialing. The audience was massive, thousands of nurses from across the country, and as I spoke about my experience and the lessons learned, I saw recognition and understanding in so many faces. After the speech, hundreds of people lined up to thank me, to share their own stories of near misses and caught frauds, to tell me about changes they'd implemented in their own facilities based on protocols I'd helped develop. One older nurse, probably in her 60s, grabbed both my hands and said with fierce intensity, "You saved my profession." We were all getting complacent, assuming the system would catch problems, trusting that credentials meant something without verifying. You woke us up, reminded us that vigilance is part of our duty. Thank you. That night, back in my hotel room, I pulled up social media out of curiosity and searched for Avery's old accounts, which had been deleted years ago but lived on in screenshots and archived posts. I looked at those carefully curated images of her fake nursing life, the borrowed scrubs and stolen photos and manufactured achievements, and felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not for what she'd done, never that, but for what I'd become because of it. She'd tried to destroy me and had instead forged me into something stronger, had tried to take my place and had instead pushed me into a position where I could protect thousands of patients instead of just the handful I'd have seen in clinical practice. Her cruelty had contained the seeds of my greatest professional achievement, and while I'd never thank her directly for that, I could acknowledge the strange alchemy that had transformed her malice into my purpose. The young intern who'd called me old and obsolete had been completely wrong. I wasn't past my time. I was just entering my most important phase, doing work that actually mattered on a scale I'd never imagined possible. And that, in the end, was the real victory, the real justice, the real triumph over everything she'd tried to do to me. So to anyone who's ever been targeted, diminished, undermined, or attacked by someone trying to tear them down to build themselves up, let my story be proof that you can survive it and even transform it into something meaningful. Take their cruelty and use it as fuel. Take their betrayal and use it as motivation. Take their attempts to destroy you and use them as catalyst for becoming more than you ever thought possible. Because sometimes the people who hurt us most give us the greatest gifts by showing us exactly what we're capable of when we refuse to be broken. I am Peyton Miller. I am 36 years old. I am a nurse and a leader and a protector of patients and profession. Someone once tried to make me believe I was old, useless, and obsolete. Instead, she accidentally helped me become the most effective, purposeful, and important version of myself I'd ever been. And that is how you really win, not by destroying your enemies, but by transforming their attacks into your greatest achievements. That fake nurse tried to end my career. Instead, she launched it into something extraordinary. And that's the real miracle of this story. Not that justice was served, though it was, but that pain became purpose, trauma became transformation, and attempted destruction became unexpected redemption, not for her, but for me, for patients, for the profession we'd both touched in such dramatically different ways, the end, but also the beginning of everything that mattered most.